The snow fell on Berchtesgaden like ash from a distant cremation, settling on the windowsills of the Berghof where Adolf Hitler stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing in particular. It was December 1944, and the war had turned into something that required more and more frequent consultations with maps that showed lines retreating rather than advancing. But on this particular afternoon, something had amused him. General Alfred Jodl had just finished reading from an intelligence report, dry, bureaucratic language that detailed the American military's plans to deploy additional combat units to the Italian front. Among the reinforcements, the 92nd Infantry Division, composed almost entirely of Negro soldiers. Hitler turned from the window, and those present would later recall that his face held something between contempt and genuine amusement. He asked Jodl to repeat the section about the racial composition of the unit. When Jodl complied, Hitler laughed, not the theatrical bark he sometimes used for propaganda purposes, but a genuine, derisive chuckle that seemed to bubble up from some deep well of certainty about the natural order of things. "The Americans send us their Negroes," he said, testing the word in German, making it sound even more dismissive than it already was. "They scrape the bottom of their barrel and send us people who cannot even share a restaurant with their white countrymen. And they expect these individuals to fight against German soldiers." He shook his head, still smiling. "The Americans insult us with this gesture. They must truly believe we are already defeated if they think such troops could make any difference." The officers in the room, men who had seen the Eastern Front, who had watched the tide turn at Stalingrad, who knew in their bones that the war was already lost, said nothing. Some nodded. Some looked at their papers. Hitler returned to the window, the moment of levity already passing, his mind moving on to other concerns. But the laughter had happened. It had been heard. And it would be remembered. The intelligence report made its way down through the Wehrmacht's command structure, translated and annotated until it reached the Italian theater where German forces were dug into the Gothic Line and the mountains beyond. Junior officers read it in dugouts and command posts. Some shared Hitler's amusement. Others, veterans of the Eastern Front who had learned not to underestimate any enemy, kept their opinions to themselves. But the general sentiment was clear. The arrival of black American troops was not a development that caused concern. If anything, it suggested that the Americans were running short of real soldiers. In the village of Viareggio on the western coast of Italy, First Lieutenant Marcus Hayes of the 370th Infantry Regiment stood in the rain and watched his men unload from the trucks that had brought them up from the port at Livorno. The rain was cold, the kind that worked its way inside your collar no matter how carefully you buttoned your jacket. The Italian countryside looked gray and exhausted, the way everything looked in the 5th year of the war. Hayes was 26 years old, from Chicago, a graduate of Howard University who had been teaching high school mathematics when Pearl Harbor happened. He had volunteered immediately, passed officer candidate school with high marks, and then spent 2 years stateside training men who were repeatedly passed over for combat deployment. Now, finally, they were here. His men moved with the efficiency of soldiers who had been drilled relentlessly but had never been tested by actual combat. Hayes could see the mixture of anticipation and dread in their faces. They were good soldiers, he knew that. They had trained as hard as any unit in the army. But they also knew what the white officers said about them, knew what the segregated mess halls and separate barracks meant, knew that the army that had brought them here didn't entirely believe in them. Staff Sergeant Robert Granger moved down the line of men, checking gear, offering quiet words of instruction. Granger was 32, older than most of the enlisted men. A veteran of the Italian campaign who had transferred from the 92nd Division after taking shrapnel in his shoulder at the Arno River. He had a way of moving that suggested he had already seen the worst things and survived them, and the younger soldiers gravitated toward his calm competence. Lieutenant Granger said, approaching Hayes with his rifle slung over one shoulder, "The men are asking what we're doing here. The white boys from the 1st Armored have been telling them we're just here to dig latrines and move supplies." Hayes looked at his sergeant, saw the carefully neutral expression that barely concealed the anger underneath. "Tell them," Hayes said slowly, "that we're here to fight. That's what we trained for. That's what we're going to do." Granger nodded, but his eyes said he would believe it when he saw it. The Gothic Line was a German defensive fortification that ran across the northern Apennine Mountains, a network of bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and minefields that represented the last major barrier before the Po Valley and the route to Austria. The Germans had been fighting a skilled defensive campaign for months, using the mountainous terrain to maximum advantage, making the Allies pay in blood for every ridgeline and valley. The winter had brought the offensive to a near standstill, but the pressure continued, probing attacks designed to find weaknesses, to keep the Germans off balance. In early January 1945, Hayes and his company were attached to a larger assault force tasked with clearing several German positions near the town of Massa. The objective was a series of fortified farmhouses on a hillside that commanded the approach to a mountain pass. Intelligence reported that the positions were held by elements of the 232nd Infantry Division, experienced troops who had been fighting in Italy since 1943. The night before the attack, Hayes sat in a farmhouse basement with his platoon leaders and studied the map by candlelight. The plan was straightforward in the way that all military plans were straightforward before contact with the enemy made them complicated. A pre-dawn artillery barrage followed by an infantry advance up the hillside under covering fire from mortar and machine guns. 2 companies would assault the main positions while Hayes's company provided support and secured the left flank. "Sir," said Second Lieutenant James Porter, who commanded the weapons platoon, "are we expecting armor support?" Hayes shook his head. "Tanks can't make it up that slope. We'll have the tank destroyers from the 614th in reserve, but the infantry goes in first." The young officers studied the map, memorizing terrain features they would need to recognize in the dark. They were quiet, focused, thinking through scenarios and contingencies. Hayes looked at their faces: Porter from Philadelphia, Lieutenant William Douglas from Atlanta, Lieutenant Henry Jackson from Detroit, and felt a surge of something that was part pride and part protective fear. These men were his responsibility. Their soldiers were his responsibility. And tomorrow they were going into combat for the first time, knowing that every mistake would be attributed not just to them but to their entire race. The artillery began at 0430 hours, a rolling thunder that shook the ground and lit the darkness with muzzle flashes. Hayes and his men moved forward in the pre-dawn gloom, staying low, advancing in short rushes from cover to cover. The hillside was steep, covered with bare trees and winter-dead brush that provided concealment but little protection. The German positions above them were silent during the barrage, but Hayes knew they would come alive as soon as the infantry got close enough. They were 200 yards from the first farmhouse when the German machine guns opened up. The sound was distinctive, the rapid, ripping noise of the MG-42, firing at a rate that made it impossible to count individual shots. Hayes hit the ground, heard his men doing the same, heard someone screaming off to his right. The tracers carved red lines through the dawn light, searching for targets. "Mortars," Hayes shouted. "Get those mortared on that position." The mortar section, led by Corporal David Martinez, set up behind a low stone wall and began dropping rounds down the tubes. The explosions walked up the hillside toward the German position, throwing dirt and smoke into the air. The machine gun fire paused, then resumed from a slightly different position. Hayes keyed his radio. "All units advance by squads. Use smoke and stay spread out." The assault unfolded with the chaotic violence that characterized small unit infantry combat. Squads moved forward while others provided covering fire. Grenades were thrown into German positions. Men died in ways that were sudden and arbitrary: a bullet from an unseen position, a mine that someone stepped on, shrapnel from a mortar round that landed in the wrong place. Hayes moved with his command group, directing fire, calling in mortar strikes, trying to maintain some coherent picture of what was happening. Sergeant Granger led his squad in a flanking movement around the left side of the first farmhouse, using a depression in the ground for concealment. They got within 20 yards before the Germans spotted them and opened fire. Private First Class Thomas Wilson took 3 rounds in the chest and died before his body hit the ground. Private Eddie Johnson was hit in the leg and went down screaming. But Granger kept moving and the men followed him. And they put grenades through the farmhouse windows and cleared the building room by room with rifles and bayonets. By mid-morning, Hayes's company had secured their objective. The cost had been 12 dead and 23 wounded. The Germans had withdrawn to their secondary positions further up the ridge, leaving behind their dead and a few shell-shocked prisoners who looked terrified of what their black captors might do to them. Hayes walked among his men as they consolidated their positions, digging in, redistributing ammunition, treating the wounded. Their faces were streaked with dirt and smoke, their eyes showing the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing violent death up close. But they had done what they came to do. They had attacked a defended position and taken it. They had fought as well as any soldiers could have fought. One of the German prisoners, a young corporal who spoke some English, kept staring at the black soldiers with an expression of confusion that went beyond simple fear. Finally, he spoke to the military intelligence officer who was processing the prisoners. "We were told," the German said haltingly, "that the Negro soldiers would not fight, that they would run at the first shot, that they were not capable, ... single quotes." He trailed off, looking around at the soldiers who had just defeated his unit. "We were told wrong." The intelligence officer wrote down the comment in his report. It would make its way up the chain of command, would be filed and forgotten. But the German corporal's observation represented something that was happening across the Italian front wherever black units were engaged in combat. The shattering of assumptions, the collision between ideology and reality. By February, the 92nd Infantry Division had been in combat for 4 months, fighting through the mountains and along the coast, taking casualties, holding positions, attacking when ordered. The division's performance had been uneven, hobbled by inadequate training, poor leadership from white officers who didn't want to be there, and the constant burden of knowing that any failure would be magnified and generalized. But individual units had fought with distinction, and the German forces opposing them had begun to take notice. A captured German intelligence report from the 148th Infantry Division, dated February 15, 1945, included this assessment. Enemy forces in our sector include elements of the American 92nd Infantry Division colored troops. Initial expectations that these units would prove inferior in combat have not been realized. The enemy displays normal combat effectiveness and in some cases exceptional small unit leadership. Defensive positions are adequately prepared. Artillery support is accurate and well coordinated. Recommend these units be accorded the same tactical consideration as standard American infantry formations. The bureaucratic language couldn't quite hide what it was saying. We were wrong. They can fight. On the Western Front, the 761st Tank Battalion had been in combat since November 1944. Attached to Patton's Third Army, the battalion's M4 Sherman tanks, each named after a racial epithet in a deliberate act of defiant irony by the crews, had fought through France and into Germany, supporting infantry assaults, breaking through defensive lines, engaging enemy armor. They had been at the Bulge, had helped contain the German offensive during the darkest days of December. Their casualties had been heavy, tanks burned dizzily, and the German anti-tank weapons were deadly, but they kept fighting. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant Samuel Turley had been with the 761st since its activation at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana. His tank, Black Panther, had survived more engagements than he could count, though they were on their third Sherman after the first two had been knocked out. Turley was from Newark, had worked as a mechanic before the war, understood machines in a way that kept his crew alive. His driver was Private First Class Leonard Smith from Mississippi. His gunner was Corporal James Washington from Brooklyn. His loader was Private Albert Green from Chicago, and his bowgunner was Private Michael Torres from Los Angeles. They were a crew, and they were good. In March 1945, they were part of a task force pushing toward the Rhine, advancing through German territory that was being defended with increasing desperation. The German army was collapsing, but it was still dangerous, still capable of inflicting terrible casualties on attackers who got careless. The engagement happened outside a small German town whose name Turley would never remember. His platoon of 5 tanks was supporting an infantry company from the 26th Infantry Division, when they encountered a German defensive position built around 2 Panther tanks and a company of infantry with Panzerfausts, the shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets that could kill a Sherman with a single hit. The lead American tank took a Panzerfaust round in the side and brewed up immediately, the crew bailing out through the escape hatches. Turley ordered his driver to reverse behind a building while he tried to spot the enemy positions. The German Panthers were hauled down behind earth berms, showing only their turrets, waiting for targets. "I see them," Washington said from the gunner's position. 2 o'clock, 800 yards, 2 tanks. Turley knew the mathematics of this engagement. The German 75mm guns on the Panthers could penetrate a Sherman's armor at this range. The Sherman's 75mm gun probably couldn't penetrate the Panther's frontal armor. This was the perpetual disadvantage that American tankers lived with, inferior vehicles that required superior tactics to survive. "Load smoke," Turley ordered. "We're going to move up and flank them." What followed was a textbook example of armored maneuver warfare. Turley's tank and 2 others laid down smoke to obscure the German view, then moved rapidly to the left, using buildings and terrain for cover, trying to get a side shot on the Panthers. The German tanks fired blind into the smoke, their rounds whistling past. The American infantry, emboldened by the tank support, began working forward with bazookas. Turley got his flank shot. Washington put a round into the side of the first Panther at 400 yards, and the German tank exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a column of flame. The second Panther tried to traverse its turret to engage, but another Sherman from Turley's platoon got there first, and a second round found the weak point where the turret met the hull. The German infantry, seeing their armor support destroyed, began to pull back. The American infantry moved in to secure the position. The engagement had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it represented the kind of small tactical victory that was being repeated thousands of times across the front, each one pushing the German army closer to collapse. That night, Turley and his crew performed maintenance on their tank by the light of lanterns, checking the tracks, cleaning the gun, refilling ammunition. They were exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, but the work had to be done. Tomorrow there would be another town, another engagement, another roll of the dice. Private Torres, who was 18 and had lied about his age to enlist, looked up from the track he was inspecting. "Sarge," he said, "you think they know? The Germans, I mean. You think they know who they're fighting?" Turley thought about the question. He thought about the German tank crews who had just died, who probably had never expected to be defeated by black American soldiers. He thought about Hitler's laughter at Berchtesgaden, about all the Nazi propaganda he had heard about on the radio, about the supreme confidence with which the Germans had prosecuted this war. "I think," Turley said slowly, "they're learning." In the German command posts and headquarters, in the after-action reports and intelligence summaries, the learning was being documented in real time. A report from Army Group G, dated March 1945, noted with bureaucratic precision, "The employment of Negro troops by the Americans has proven more effective than anticipated. These units demonstrate adequate discipline and training. Their performance in both offensive and defensive operations falls within the parameters of standard American infantry and armor units. Previous assessments suggesting inherent combat inefficiency due to racial factors have been contradicted by field observations." The language was careful, technical, designed not to sound like an admission of fundamental error, but that's what it was. Every report that documented the combat effectiveness of black American troops was another nail in the coffin of the racial ideology that had justified the war in the first place. By April 1945, the war was in its final weeks. German resistance was fragmenting, cities were falling, the Nazi leadership was in hiding or fleeing or preparing for suicide. The black American units that had landed in Europe were still fighting, still taking casualties, still proving something that shouldn't have needed proving. Lieutenant Hayes and the survivors of his company were in northern Italy pursuing German forces that were withdrawing toward Austria. The fighting had lost some of its intensity. The Germans were running now, not making determined stands, but it was still dangerous. Snipers, booby traps, desperate last stands by officers who wouldn't surrender. Sergeant Granger had been promoted to platoon leader after Lieutenant Porter was killed by artillery fire near Massa. He moved through the mountains with the caution of someone who had survived this long by never assuming the war was over until it was actually over. His men followed him, trusting his judgment, knowing he would get them through if anyone could. They entered a small village in the Alps on April 28th and found it abandoned, except for a German captain and 3 enlisted men who were too wounded to evacuate. The captain lay in the remains of what had been the town's inn, his leg badly injured, his face gray with pain and shock. He watched the black American soldiers enter with an expression that combined fear, resignation, and something else that Hayes couldn't quite identify. Granger called for a medic, and Private Jackson, who had been a medical student before the war, began treating the German officer's wounds. The German captain watched this in silence, then spoke in heavily accented English. "I read," he said, struggling with the words, "reports about the colored soldiers. We were told you would not be good fighters. We were told many things." He paused, breathing heavily. It was all lies. Everything was lies. Hayes stood in the doorway, watching his medic save the life of an enemy soldier who had probably killed American soldiers, who had fought for a regime built on lies about racial superiority. The irony was so thick it was almost visible. "Yeah," Hayes said quietly. "It was all lies." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The celebrations were muted in the black American units, who knew that they were going home to a country that still wouldn't let them eat in the same restaurants or use the same water fountains as white Americans. They had fought as well as any soldiers in history, had died in the same mud and bled the same blood, had proven beyond any doubt that courage and skill had nothing to do with skin color, and for many of them it would make no difference. But it had made a difference on the battlefield. The Germans who had faced black American soldiers in combat had learned what Hitler refused to believe, that the ideology of racial supremacy was not just morally bankrupt, it was factually wrong. Every engagement, every tactical victory, every moment of courage under fire had been a refutation of Nazi racial theory. The black soldiers who fought in Europe had defeated more than just German military units. They had defeated an idea, had proved it false in the only way that couldn't be denied or explained away. In the mountains of northern Italy, in the fields of France, in the towns of Germany, there were graves marked with temporary crosses that bore the names of men who had died, proving something that should never have needed proof. Staff Sergeant Robert Granger survived the war and returned to Detroit, where he worked as a postal carrier and never talked much about what he had done in Europe. Tank Commander Samuel Turley stayed in the army, eventually retiring as a sergeant major after serving in Korea and Vietnam. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes went back to teaching, and every year on the anniversary of that first assault near Massa, he would think about the 12 men who died under his command and wonder if it had been worth it. Hitler never laughed about black American soldiers again. By the time the reports from the front made it clear that his assessment had been catastrophically wrong, he was dead in a bunker in Berlin, his 1,000-year Reich reduced to rubble and ash. The racial ideology that had justified the war and the genocide had been defeated not just by superior numbers and industrial capacity, but by the courage of men whom that ideology declared subhuman. The final terrible irony was this: the black soldiers who had helped destroy Nazi Germany went home to an America that was still segregated, still discriminatory, still unwilling to grant them full citizenship. It would take another 20 years and another kind of war fought in courtrooms, in streets and lunch counters before the country they had fought for would begin to acknowledge what they had proven in the mountains of Italy and the fields of France. But on the battlefield, in the moment of combat, they had been undeniable. The enemy had recognized them even if their own country wouldn't. And that recognition, documented in captured German reports and witnessed by German soldiers who survived to remember, stands as testimony to a truth that transcends propaganda, that courage, skill, and humanity cannot be defined by skin color, and that those who believe otherwise will always be proven wrong by the facts on the ground. The laughter at Berchtesgaden had been based on certainty, on the absolute conviction that the natural order of things would prevent black soldiers from being effective in combat. The silence that followed, the silence of German commanders who stopped dismissing black units, the silence of soldiers who learned respect for an enemy they had been taught to despise, the silence of an ideology confronted with its own falseness. That silence was the sound of history correcting a lie. In the end, that was what the black soldiers who fought in World War II accomplished. They forced the world to confront the distance between ideology and reality, between propaganda and truth. They did it in the hardest way possible, with their blood and their lives, and they did it without the recognition they deserved. But they did it. And because they did it, the laughter stopped, and in its place was the undeniable fact of their victory.